Dr. Shellie here. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Dr. Shellie with Public Agenda, and I'm thanking you all early because do I have a treat for you. Today, we're going to be talking about disability policy, and I'm going to introduce two near and dear friends of mine. First is Mr. John Williams. He's the editor of the Spotsylvania Gazette and the Patch newspapers. John has a disability himself, and he's a guardian of a developmentally disabled sibling. John has been a long resident of Spotsylvania County, Virginia. He's active in the community. He's a leader in his church, and he's an amazing colleague. My other guest is Mr. Seth Whitten. Did I pronounce your name correctly, sir?
Yes, that's correct.
Seth is the Deputy Director of Disability Resource Center, also known as DRC. The DRC is a nonprofit center for independent living and serves Central Virginia area. And in this role, he helps oversee day-to-day operations, program development, and grant implementation and staff leadership with a focus on independent living services, home modification program, and disability advocacy grounded in lived experience and community needs. That's a lot. But you know what? It takes Seth to do a lot for the community. And so I introduce those two gentlemen to you. Thank you. And thank you for being here.
Great to be here.
So before we're going to go ahead and jump right in, there's a lot that I want to cover with you all. The reason we do this is to edify the community and just give them some information that they may not have otherwise. So as you know, you've received early on, I prepared several questions that I think the community may want answers to, or that can probably use answers to help, just in their own personal situation. So let me go ahead and start. I'm going to start from the top and question one. So I'll throw this out, and Seth, if you want to jump in, first you can, give me, your response. John, I'd love to get your perspective on question one as well. And then if there's need for follow-up, or we can just have a casual discussion around it and go from there. So from your lived experience and your engagement in local politics, how would you define disability policy as a public responsibility rather than a charitable service?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. That's a great question. And real quick, just my lived experience, just to share with you. I lost my foot in an accident with the train over in Harrisonburg, Virginia, when I was 14. I was really fortunate to have the resources and the support that I needed to bounce right back. If you're thinking about cutting off a foot, 14 is a great age to do it. But what I'll say is, as I've come into adulthood, I've realized how lucky I was in so many ways. And to answer your question, I think the cleanest way to say it is this, and that's that disability policy is about whether public systems are designed to work for the full population, right? It's not about whether we feel generous towards a subset of people. When disability gets treated like charity, access becomes conditional. It depends on who's asking, how compelling their story is, whether there's funding left, or whether someone decides that you're deserving enough. And public policy is different. Policy recognizes that disability is a predictable part of our human condition, and that access to employment, education, housing, transportation, and civic life has to be built into systems from the start.
John, you want to add anything with regard to your lived experiences? And you are on mute, sir.
Mine is a little bit more of a two-pronged thing, which I actually changed a little bit. In the terms of my example with public is I do a lot of work on election day, and the whole thing of the need, the access to the voting place, and having curbside voting, and even down to the fact, even the volunteers standing out there. If the Board of Elections is not out there, we want them to be out there. The other one is when I look about charitable. By the way, my brother is 62, and he's on SSDI just like I am, and he's been in a wheelchair all his life. But we've been very, very fortunate in Pennsylvania, what we've been able, the support we've gotten for him. It's the school that he's at, of course, was private with federal funding, but also on the charitable end as well. In fact, that's that school, the Terrible Towel, the Pittsburgh Steelers, and the sportscaster who all the profits go to Allegheny Valley School. So there's a little bit of both public, private, and the charitable end is
So
that's
John,
there.
would you say the support that you just spoken of, and would you say that that's a public responsibility?
It Yes, I truly believe that. Of course, I come from the days when state hospitals existed, and we could talk all day what went on. But yes, it is.
Okay. Okay. So all right. So which leads me to the second question. What do you believe most public officials misunderstand about disability as a policy domain that affects access, autonomy, and dignity? And
I'll jump in here and I'll say, I really think that the biggest misunderstanding is that disability policy so often gets treated as this narrow, specialized issue instead of this cross-cutting systems issue that touches almost every area of public life, right? I think a lot of public officials still think in terms of disability services as a silo, something that's handled by a specific agency or a line item in the budget or a nonprofit partner, but access, autonomy, and dignity aren't delivered by a single program. They're shaped by how employment systems are structured, how housing is built and financed, how transportation networks form, how education is delivered, and how administrative rules are getting written and enforced.
so, Seth, do you think is there anything that the people can do to help fine tune, the perspective of disability policy in terms of how public officials see it, so that way the public is better served under disability policy?
I think so. I think it's just so important to understand that, as we said, it's not one thing. It's not one department, and recognizing that so many different state agencies have roles in making things more accessible and making things more equitable for people with disabilities. And, I think oftentimes there's this misunderstanding about time and energy, and oftentimes disability policy kind of in that formal way assumes that folks have unlimited capacity to navigate forms, to file appeals, to maneuver and navigate waiting lists and these fragmented systems. And what gets missed is that the cumulative burden of managing access can become a barrier in and of itself. And dignity, it's not just about whether access exists, it's about whether people can use it without exhausting themselves or sacrificing their independence.
Hmm. John?
I agree with you wholeheartedly, Seth. Um, my big thing on the politician end, half the time and I'm going from being a guardian, they've never seen what goes on in these. My brother was one of the first ones that went into a residential home. And we know there was a lot of arguing back in the day. But the thing is, there's so many layers. And you talked about the waiting list, and we're going to see that in the other questions, especially on the housing end. Um, it's there's a belief system there too. But I also look at dignity, and I've talked to case managers about it, how the person is treated.
Okay. So John, all right. So the third question is, the ADA establishes civil rights framework for access, accommodations, and non-discrimination. In your experience, where do you observe the greatest gap between the law as it is written and how it's implemented?
I'm going to jump in.
Yeah, yeah, I was aiming at you with that question, sir.
All right. Well, Dr. Bowman and Seth, I have a little bit of an experience with this. First of all, it's a lot of language, it's a lot of general language when it comes to the act itself. And years ago, I might as well say it this way, I was a young intern and we were in Maryland and I'm standing in front of a hair salon. Of course, there was no elevator and it was not accessible. And that politician, who's very well known, started talking about grandfathering
Hmm.
and that any building after 1990 could be excluded. And I sat in there and I said, boy, and I went back, there are exceptions to the rule here.
Hmm. So are you saying that?
And that still exists to this day, right?
Yeah, yeah, it
About
does.
the grandfathering.
Yeah,
So
it does.
okay, so really quick, what I'm hearing then is grandfathering could very well be one of the issues in terms of baking in some of the missed opportunities for improvements for individuals with disabilities rather than taking a fresh look and solving for something that may have been an issue at that point in time. Am I reading that correctly, either of you two?
Yeah, I think you are. And, the ADA came along and, we're trying to kind of retrofit accessibility at that point. And so it's understandable, you're trying to deal with these bolted on solutions and you kind of end up with Frankenstein's monster sometimes. And so, I want to make it clear that, as a disability community, we're not trying to put businesses under by saying, oh, you need to put in an elevator. I had a
Yeah.
friend out on the Eastern Shore of Virginia recently who runs a nonprofit art organization. And he's asking me, how do we make it more accessible? What are we required to do? And would we love to see every space be accessible? Absolutely, we would. But really, what we want to see is that with the ADA as it is, which is a great civil rights framework, that if you're going in and you're seriously changing a building, then you make it accessible. You do what you can that's reasonable, and people aren't required to do things that are overly burdensome or costly. But in my experience, the biggest gap between the ADA as it's written and the ADA as it's implemented shows up where formal compliance and lived access is supposed to begin, right? The ADA establishes that strong framework, but in practice, it's often just treated as a checklist rather than an outcome. And we would like to see more of a just broad understanding that we could do things right the first time. And I think throughout our conversation, we're gonna come back to this theme of a lot of times like this accessibility, these accommodations are kind of seen as, oh, yep, we're checking the boxes. And employment's a really clear example of that. I mean, the ADA prohibits discrimination and it requires reasonable accommodations, but the process for actually securing those accommodations often depends on disclosure, documentation, and an informal negotiation between an employee and an employer. And as a result, the rights exist on paper, but access, when it comes to practice, really depends heavily on workplace culture. It depends on individual supervisors, whether a disabled worker or worker with a disability has the time, the resources, and the capacity to self-advocate. So, what my dream is, and I dream big, but one day we'll have a world where these things are just kind of baked in, and it's not me having to be the one, carrying so much of the weight, but that, the systems we've created are more accessible. And under the ADA, we kind of assume that individuals will enforce their rights one barrier at a time. And what's missing in implementation is that systems level approach that treats access as a baseline design requirement as opposed to an exception that you've got to request. And the law is strong. The ADA is great, but when implementation relies on self-advocacy and minimal compliance, it places a disproportionate burden on people whose disabilities can already make navigating these systems a lot more difficult.
Okay. So which leads me to number 8. In your judgment, what's the most important change public agencies could make to reduce administrative burden for people with disabilities?
John, do you mind if I jump in on this one too? I talk a lot, so you just get your cane and pull me off.
Okay.
If I had to identify one change that would make the biggest difference, it would be shifting administrative systems from a model that assumes constant self-advocacy to one that assumes continuity, coordination, and trust. And, what does that mean? I think right now, there are a lot of public agencies that are designed around repeated verification. You ask people to prove the same information over and over and over. And John could probably tell you in his experience as a guardian, like, you're applying for Social Security and for someone, it's like, hey, are they still disabled? It's like, yeah, you know what? Seth's foot didn't grow back. And, I think like that approach really treats disability as this episodic or exceptional thing rather than the ongoing and predictable thing that it is. So, reducing some of those administrative burdens by building systems that recognize permanence where it exists and share information across programs instead of having to recollect it could really make a big difference for people, I think.
So John, same question, but rather than from a point of judgment, from your lived experience, what's the most important change public agencies could make to reduce the administrative burden for people with disabilities? Because you have a dual perspective here. You have a perspective as an individual
Right.
with a disability as well as a care provider. So I'm curious to know your vantage point, sir.
Well, and Seth kind of touched on this about the layering. I want to see more modernization. And I'm on SSDI. My brother's on SSDI, curiously. And again, we need to stop seeing, we need to decrease the number of people that are being denied services, because there's that infamous thing that people have been turned down 3, 4, 5 times. You know about this, Seth, I'm sure. Even down, in my case, looking at the therapist and that documentation. I sometimes take those papers and put them to the side because many people, I had to go to a lawyer. I had to make sure he was writing it right to what's there in order to get it. And there's not a lot of leeway. There really isn't. And even down to having a second opinion, someone saying to you, and Seth, you probably heard this over and over again, please be quiet while you go in there and come out. But, dignity is, there's a lot to be said about it. I think we need to think a lot. And it would be wonderful if we can start thinking about that person who's disabled.
Yeah. And if I could say, I mean, I think another critical shift here would be moving away from this kind of reactive thing we have to more proactive support in some of these agencies and some of these government departments, so that instead of requiring individuals with disabilities to identify benefits, to request services, and then follow up repeatedly. I think that agencies could do a lot to provide clearer, standardized information, and assign responsibility within the system for guiding people through the processes. Right now, we've kind of got this thing where access depends on how persistent or knowledgeable somebody is, and the system often rewards capacity rather than need, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It really does. Just from my experience of and colleagues that I have who traveled, who have to manage and navigate that situation. So, all right. So, number 9 is many disability benefits are subject to income limits, asset caps, and work disincentives. How have you observed these constraint impacts? How have
Let
you
me jump
observed?
in
Let me let me
as a
let me
person
let,
and
let, let,
as,
let me finish, John, please.
oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear it. I
How have you
apologize.
observed these constraints impact the independence or economic stability of individuals with disabilities? Let me repeat that question because I got tongue-tied there. So forgive me. Many
That's okay.
disability benefits are subject to income limits, asset caps, and work disincentives. How have you observed these constraints impact the independence or economic stability of individuals with disabilities? So in short, their economic constraints and caps on assets and income if you receive disabilities. What's been the impact on economic stability of individuals with disabilities? There you go. So, John, you can jump in now. I'm sorry, sir.
Sure. And I'm going on the personal thing right now.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
several other people that I know, um, including one as a 70-year-old mother, is still pushing with Seth. You don't mind to mention DARS, right? As an example,
Right.
because she's there morning, noon, and night making sure. And, how much can you make? Uh, you can only make 1,600. You go above, um, you have all kinds of things going on, and you have no money at the end of the day. Okay. One of the things I went, they did not help me. I found all the jobs. So did he. And to be, he's a plumber, all right, by training. I was going to say this later. And they wanted him to push shopping carts, all right. So many people are typecast. They're not being paid enough. We've heard all this stuff. And the other thing is, they're not being educated what's being offered out there. And my example is Ticket to Work,
Okay.
because here I am now back working again because the way the economy is. I taught for years in the school system. My wife is now pretty much so retired, but also working in the school system because you can't survive.
Mm,
And now I'm using Ticket to Work. In a way, I had 9 months. I got both. Now I'm at 48 months. If I make too much, I have my salary. If I have too little, I get my disability. I always have it. But the thing that always distressed me and has distressed me, that so many people don't even know this exists.
mm,
And if you don't know to ask the question, I mean, we talk a lot in our office and in our organization about you don't know what you don't know, right? And we talk about how do you know what questions to ask when you don't know what questions to ask. And that's where, John, as you're saying, like, vocational rehab, and I don't mean to pick on DARS because they do a lot of really great work in
Oh, they
Virginia.
do.
but they're not the experts on, ticket to work and work incentive programs like that. And unless to ask, I mean, I was talking to an employee who's recently come on with us today who's juggling this, you know, 30 puzzle and trying to figure it out. And it's like, well, this answer's over here and that answer's over there. And that's one of the things that's so cool about these centers for independent living is we can kind of be that middleman that helps try to connect the dots. But again,
Right.
I think there are ways we could kind of bake it into the system so that people are coordinating and communicating a little bit better across agencies. I don't know if it's, just standardizing the information that we do give people or exactly how to do it. I mean, I'll leave that to people that are a lot smarter than me, but just coordinating things could help a lot.
Okay.
Shellie, can I throw one more thing in?
Yeah, please.
Um, I'm gonna segue away from that a little bit. Coming to see you all, and that was in the hearing loss meeting, but it kind of wove in with my brother. I think it was the former director, and we were talking about the ADA. I had no idea what a waiver was for disabled. But she turned to me and said, "Well, that's what your brother has."
Hmm.
Yeah. And just for the record, the Medicaid waivers are available in all states. They cover different services, but if you're determined eligible for a waiver, whether in Virginia, there's Medicaid waivers, and then there's CCC Plus, which is a waiver that if you require a nursing home level of care, says, well, you can get services that'll keep you in your home. And it's just smart policy. I'm not going to quote you the numbers on what it costs to keep somebody in a nursing home, but I think it's like $20,000 or more a month.
Yeah.
And so, if we can keep people in their communities, that's what we're really all about. And I have definitely, I mean, to get back to speaking directly to this question, like I've definitely observed how income limits and asset caps and work disincentives can undermine people's independence, even when they're trying to be responsible, productive, and self-sufficient. One of the examples we see regularly, we've got some home modification grant programs that we run at the state and also federal level. We've got a HUD grant that we administer, and these programs fund modest changes like ramps, bathroom modifications, safer entryways. We're not going in and hanging up like gold plated ornamentation in people's homes, but these are things that make a real difference in whether somebody can live safely and independently. And on both of our grant programs at the state and federal level, eligibility is capped at 80% of the area median income, which, it's not poor, but we're talking, in the $50,000 to $70,000 range, depending on how many people, and it can go above that, depending on how many people are in your house and what your county is, what your cost of living is. But somebody who falls just above that line can be completely excluded, even though their accessibility needs haven't changed and they still can't afford that work out of pocket. And what's really troubling is who gets caught in that gap, right? And it's often people working, they're trying to increase their hours, they're trying to stabilize their income, and they're doing exactly what our policies are supposed to encourage. But because disability related costs don't disappear when their income rises slightly, crossing an eligibility threshold can mean losing access to supports that are absolutely essential for people's daily function.
Hmm. So, okay. Wow, it's clear that these income and asset caps have a significant impact on people because I would imagine largely because the spectrum upon which, the population, the disability population rests is pretty vast. And so which leads me to the question, in number 11, for reference, how well do current education and workforce programs prepare the disabled community members for meaningful participation in the labor market? And
John,
so
do you mind?
I ask that because of how that correlates to one's ability to earn income.
Yeah, yeah. And what I would say about that is that, current education and workforce programs are uneven in how well they prepare people for meaningful participation in the labor market. There are places where the structure works, and there are a lot of places where it falls short. And that's not because of lack of effort, but because of how success is defined and how it's measured. With the education side of things, a lot of programs focus heavily on compliance and access to services rather than on long-term outcomes. And so students may get accommodations or supports in school, but then there's often limited connection between those supports and the expectation of the labor market. Way too often we see education systems that emphasize credential completion without ensuring students are actually gaining transferable skills, work experience, and exposure to real employment environments. And, same thing in workforce programs like the vocational rehab and employment supports can be effective when they're well resourced and flexible, but in practice, they're often constrained by caseloads, staffing shortages at these agencies, and narrow performance metrics where success is sometimes measured by placement rather than by job quality. And John mentioned this earlier, where you got a licensed plumber pushing carts around in a parking lot, and can really it often results in people getting steered towards low wage or segregated employment, even rather than supported towards careers that really match their interests and abilities.
John, you have any experience in that space?
Well, just to follow up on what Seth said, he needed his 70-year-old mother to constantly keep pushing at the case managers
Mm.
to make sure that and I'm going to talk about, I'm going away to the life altering thing because the job he has now is overnight. He's a custodian with TSA. Wow. And
Mm.
it's a good salary and everything. Oh, he's having to work at night. And he's highly functioning developmentally disabled. All right. With he's not developmentally, I'm not getting the term out. I'm getting tongue tied. He is intellectually developmentally disabled.
Okay.
So, you know what? She's also pushing because she's not going to be there someday. And I see that with lots of my friends, lots of our friends who are older. And now they know that they're not going to be there anymore as the caretaker or as the guardian. And that's a hard situation.
So,
Um, I'm sorry.
go ahead, Seth.
I was going to say one other thing I just wanted to make sure to highlight here is that, with respect to workforce programs, I think a lot of programs underestimate the role of employer readiness. And preparing somebody with a disability for work is not enough if the workplace themselves aren't prepared to offer accessible environments, flexible scheduling people might need, or meaningful advancement. And really, without addressing employer practices and expectations, workforce programs can end up preparing people for jobs that just aren't sustainable.
So, so to that end, Seth, because we know in any agency, in any program, it's all powered by people. And so I'd be remiss if I didn't call out, and this is coming from 14, people, perspectives, and stigma. What role does stigma play in the policy outcomes or in the processes that we're speaking to, or and even down to the expectations of policymakers? All these things happen, but they happen by people, and people and stigma, you know, what type of role does that play in all of this?
I think when we talk about stigma, absolutely, like in the workplace, I think 100% limits opportunities for people. I had a situation with one of our staff members recently who's a gentleman with cerebral palsy. His speech is difficult to understand. All he wanted to do was update his cell phone number. He does our Medicaid billing. He's very capable, but is a wheelchair user. And if you don't have exposure to people with cerebral palsy who you may not understand their speech, you may make all sorts of assumptions and bring this stigma to bear. But all we needed to do was update his cell phone number so that he could get his multi-factor authentication codes and continue, working in this billing portal. And this isn't some little podunk company. I mean, this is a third-party contractor to $1 billion managed care organization. And, they said, well, we have to talk to him directly. And I said, well, you can talk to him directly. Go ahead, Bob, say hello. And he said, hello. We can't understand him. And I said, yes. So I'm here, to help interpret.
Yeah.
And they said, well, we've got to talk to him though. And I said, okay, you can talk to him. And, we stopped this loop and they said, well, maybe the best thing would be for you to become the admin on the account and then you can make him a user. And I told them with all due respect, like, if that is the only option you're going to offer us, then, I don't know what we can do other than me formally request a reasonable accommodation. But I don't want to take this very capable person who's our admin and say, well, you're not the admin anymore because they can't figure out a way to jump on Zoom and to see you and allow you to type as you talk to them. And that's stigma. It's that they're going, oh, people like that can't function at that level. And, really what concerns me most about that stigma in the real world and the policy world too, is that, stigma lowers expectations across the board. And if policymakers assume that disability inherently limits people's quality of life or their competence or capacity, then stabilization becomes the goal instead of growth, safety instead of opportunity, and containment instead of participation. And, stigma doesn't just shape attitudes, it shapes outcomes. And if we build policy on the belief that disability equals diminished life or diminished capacity, then the system is going to reflect that belief, no matter how neutral or compassionate our language and our intent may appear on the surface.
John?
Having been brought up of respecting people's belief systems, all right? We know there are policymakers out there that do not understand this. There are some, oh my goodness, and I remember very well back in the day, and I did work on Capitol Hill at one point, and I had, we were talking about the ADA and dealing with Tony Coelho and with Steny Hoyer. The thing is that a lot of people, like you said, Seth, excuse me, like you said, people look at people, and I've seen it even with myself, and they say, well, wait a minute, you may not be that capable of doing this. And I know lots of friends, and I'll admit I've done it too. Sometimes I don't mention it, especially as I've gotten older, because, we're living in a modern society now, but there are still things out there about disabilities that we're light years behind on. And maybe that goes to education again.
So
when it goes to conclusion
okay,
too,
go ahead, Seth.
I was just going to say, I think so often, and I ask my friends, how many people with disabilities do you work with? And of course, I work in an organization where, our goal is more than 50% of our staff and our board of directors are people with disabilities. And so you get that exposure. And, again, I don't mean to act like I walk on water or always approach these things in the correct way. I mean, I'm learning every day too. And, it's but by the grace of God that I've been placed in situations where folks that I may have looked at some point and said, "Oh, geez, no, that's not who should be doing our Medicaid billing." I've had the opportunity to be placed in situations where it just blows up all of those misconceptions and negative
Yeah.
stereotypes.
So I'm gonna throw a word out there. I'm gonna to each of you. Just tell me what it means to you. I'll start with you, John. It's not necessarily a word, but it's a term. Environment, I'm sorry, disability justice.
And I have had to deal with that.
What does that mean to you?
What disability justice to me is making sure that we are being inclusive. If we're not being inclusive, or we're not looking to the dignity of the consumer, then we have to do something about it.
Okay. Seth?
I mean, the first thing I want to say about disability justice is, it's not about special treatment for those people. It's about uh, society that works for everybody. And so often with these things, like, and we see it from, I love my speech to text um, tools that allow me to speak to my phone and it turns it into text, and I don't have to sit here typing. Those are things that were developed for people with disabilities. They've made the world a better place. I love the automatic door openers when I walk into our office and I've got my hands full and can reach my knee up and bump it. I mean, it works for me. It works for a mom with a stroller, all sorts of people. And, I think disability justice really demands that we look beyond individual stories and we focus on systems, and that it's about whether people can show up, whether they can show up to work, school, public meetings, a ballot box without facing barriers that other people never have to think about. And, when those barriers exist, participation is conditional and everything becomes less representative, but it's not something that just hurts people with disability. I mean, a lot of what we're talking about when we talk about accessibility, I like to frame it as universal design,
Mm,
and we're talking about when we say, let's go back and look at these systems, and think about how are they built from the ground up? Is inclusion, is access built in there? And if it is, it doesn't just benefit people with disabilities. It's not a niche. It's not a niche issue. It's a test of whether things are fair, usable, and worthy of trust. And and that's good for everybody.
okay. So, we're at a point in which we turn a new year. There's a lot of change, that we're undergoing here in the Commonwealth and abroad. And so some of that change are new lawmakers taking offices, new oath of offices, being sworn in. So, Seth, I'll start with you. If there was a message you wanted to send to our state or our lawmakers in general with regard to disability policy and the lived experiences of the disabled community, what would that message be?
I think I'd want them to commit to treating disability policy as an ongoing responsibility, not a one-time promise or a symbolic gesture. One of the things that I started my career working for an organization, a nonprofit organization that we would now call a sheltered workshop. It's a segregated workplace. It's an old model, and there are some things about it that may make a lot of sense. But what happened was under the Fair Labor Standards Act, these organizations were able to pay wages that often were below minimum wage because they would measure people's productivity.
Mm,
And so, in the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen that model really come under a lot of scrutiny. And well, it should. We shouldn't be paying people less just because they have a disability. But what I've seen is, politicians and even some advocates get so caught up in this. We've got to get rid of these subminimum wages, and I think that's important. Again, don't hear me say that I think we should go back to that, but the reality is that, as we've closed down those organizations and made them move into different models, and we've got politicians who take the victory lap and pat themselves on the back and highlight the worst case scenarios where this person was getting paid 12 cents an hour and that's not okay. And no, that's not okay. But what we've done is we've and you got to break eggs to make omelets, right? But when we're breaking eggs without even having a recipe, that's where I see that we are a lot of the time in disability employment, because I've watched as politicians in states around the country have been taking victory laps for eliminating subminimum wage, but they're not looking at the outcome. They're not looking at, yeah, but what did that actually do to the number of people with disabilities who are in the workforce? And again, I'm not, do not hear me say that I think we should go back to that, but I think we've got to look at outcomes in a way instead of just grabbing that soundbite thing that can stir people's emotions and saying, look, we fixed it. It's an ongoing responsibility. And, I want more of a commitment to implementation, not just legislation. Passing a law or funding a program is not the end of the job. They've got to publicly commit to monitoring the policy impacts of those actions. Whether our service being delivered on time, is access better than it was, is it reliable, or are there people falling through the gaps that have been created? And that's what I would say, because I think so a lot of the times, and particularly with that employment issue, I've seen it where it's you're the good guys, you're getting rid of subminimum wages, and that is good, and I thank anyone who's ever worked on that. But at the same point, what's next? The work is not done.
John, if there's a message you want to send.
All right, and chime in on Seth, and I know I'm going to the Commonwealth, that big thing about affordability. And we have the opportunity right now, but we also have an urgency. And that's where I'm going to throw over to my educated, working in the public school system and dealing with my brother, the U.S. Department of Education. How are we going to solve these problems? We've had great programs, Ideal. We've had IEP for adults. We had, of course, my brother Ken is on IDT, of course, and I've experienced all of that sitting in the room, him sitting in the room. And what are the states going to do? What kind of thing are they going to do outside the box to make sure that people are still getting their services?
So if I'm hearing you correctly, your concern that you would like to convey to lawmakers is, what are they going to do to ensure that the that members from in the disability community continue getting their services, whether it be
That
okay, I understand that. Okay. Well, no, this was good. I really appreciate both of you, your time. And as we wrap up, I want to ask you, John, quickly in the next 30 seconds, if anybody wants to reach out to you, where can they find you? And one last word.
we can always find me at the Spotsylvania Gazette, and my email address, if I can give that,
Sure can.
is johwilli@gmail.com. And I really appreciated this, Shellie, Dr. Bowman, because we've opened something up here that people need to consider, especially now with the changes we're seeing at the federal level. How are we going to be able, as I'm saying now, Seth, how are we going to be able, in a system where one state is different than another state. We didn't really touch on that. Even down to the ADA. How are we going to be able to at least stay at the status quo, what we have right now? And that's going to be a real issue. We saw the legislature here in Virginia come back in, and they've got to think outside the box a little bit as we go along.
Okay, thank you. And Seth, if if people want to find you, where could they find you? And one last word.
Yeah, absolutely. If anybody is ever looking for me or support from the Disability Resource Center, and again, I want to make sure people know we are one center for independent living in the state of Virginia. There are 17 of us around the state. There are over 400 all around the country. So these organizations are everywhere, and we are here to be the go-to for any question about disability. If people live outside of our service area, they're welcome to call us, and we will connect them with those that can help. Our phone number here at the DRC, 540-373-2559, or they can email me directly. My email is swhitten@cildrc.org. And if I had one parting bit of I don't know if it's wisdom, but parting words that I'd like to share is just, we talked earlier about how when the ADA was passed, it was very much by necessity and by the nature of how things were that we're kind of going back and trying to retrofit and do these bolted on solutions. And I would challenge people in the 21st century to realize like, the only reason we're still having to so often deal with these bolted on solutions that put so much of the burden on people with disabilities and really reward capacity over need is because we failed to kind of rebuild things from the ground up. And I'm not saying burn it down. I'm not that person. I mean, I am here to create a more accessible, inclusive world for everybody. And I really believe we can do that, but I think we've got to change our thinking. I think we're still kind of trapped in some pre-ADA thinking. And one of the things the ADA doesn't do for us is really help people reconceive of how the world could be. How can we, take the principles of universal design and apply those not just to the built world, but across the board to systems, to our thinking, to the way that we approach disability, up to and until the point that we don't see disability as a negative thing. I'm proud to be a Virginian with a disability, to be an American with a disability, and I feel a real responsibility to work hard to create a world where other people can find the success and the opportunities that I have.
Thank you. But that about wraps us up. I want to give a sincere thanks, to you, John and Seth, for your time, your words of wisdom, your insights, your lived experiences. My hope is that anyone watching, listening, and reading will take away from this and be able to find some edification for themselves or someone that they know or care about. This is Public Agenda, Dr. Shellie. You can follow us at Substack at Dr. Shellie, as well as connect with us on TikTok at Dr. Shellie Public Agenda. Stay well, everyone.